Today we are going to discuss our ancestors' immigration records. And so with this is going to be a very broad overview of the types of immigration records you can find for your ancestors. And so some of these are going to be ones you expect, and some of them I'm hoping will be ones that you have never seen before and I'm introducing you to. So, but it is focused on something that is a record documenting your ancestors' immigration. Oops. So we all are looking for those passenger lists for our immigrants. And we believe that passenger list is the only document we need to understand that immigrant ancestor. But in order to get those records, we would need to know certain details before we search for that passenger list. Knowing the chronological events of a person's life helps us narrow down our time period for that arrival. And we can search for a passenger list knowing the time period, the port that the person arrived in, and the person's ethnicity can also help us with finding our immigrant ancestors. Something to keep in mind, though, is sometimes we may never find that actual passenger list we're looking for. And instead, we're going to rely on some supplemental records. These records still document our immigrants and them coming over to the United States, but they are not actually passenger lists. So we're going to start off with the actual passenger list that people are interested in. We're going to discuss what is available and what was collected. So before 1820, there are very few records that exist for this time period. Typically, these records were kept by the port of departure, the colony, the state, or the port city who might regulate the passenger list. And some of these lists were documented at the port of departure in British countries. Our US government did not start maintaining passenger list records until 1820. So this is why these earlier records are more complicated. So here's an example of a record you could find for colonial immigration. And the books that are mentioned in this program today are in your handout as well. And I did list the call number if you're local to Fort Wayne. And otherwise, there is the actual citation for the book. That way you can get it from your local library or, well, maybe see if you can get it interlibrary loan or purchase it. So you do have access to all the ones I'm going to show you today. So here with this one, the Pennsylvania German pioneers, here is a list of foreigners that Captain Hugh Campbell of the ship Anderson reported to the Philadelphia State House on September 27th of 1752. This ship was originally from Rotterdam. It stopped at Portsmouth, England, before arriving in Philadelphia. Or you can have a colonial record such as this from the same book. This is a list of foreigners arriving in Philadelphia and signing an oath of allegiance. And this is the list of Palatines imported on the ship Charming Betty on October 12th of 1733. So this is just to show you from one particular book how these lists can vary in what we get to see. When we are searching for immigrant records, we need to be careful to follow the trail and, well, that spelling change issue that can occur. Here's an example from Strasburger's book on Pennsylvania German pioneers. And in this example, it shows us here Balsar Line, spelled Leine, arriving in Philadelphia on October 2nd, 1727 on the ship Adventure. And the ship's master, John Davies, is signing off here. And the reason for this is those arriving, the ship's master would actually go to the courthouse and file who he transported over, who was an immigrant. So this comes into play where it's an immigrant from a foreign country coming into the colony. So that would include these Palatines on this example. The citation for this particular list says that it came from the minutes of the Provincial Council found in the Colonial Records book, volume 3, page 288. Now remember, we're following this trail involving the name or the spelling changes. If I look in a different book, this one called Collection of Upwards of 30,000 Names of German, Swiss, Dutch, French, and Other Immigrants in Pennsylvania from 1727 to 1776 by Daniel Rupp, it shows me a different spelling here, Baltas, B-A-L-T-A-S, last name Lime, L-E-I-M, arriving the same date on the same ship. And it is giving me the exact same citation for where this passenger list came from. So we're going to continue following this trail. It keeps referring to the archive series Colonial Records for volume 3. So let's look at that. Here's the minutes of the Provincial Council, volume 3. And we are looking at page 288, and we see that same ship, same date, and the third spelling. Balzar, B-A-L-Z-A-R, Lime, L-Y-M-E, having appeared before the Provincial Council and declared his intent to settle and live in Pennsylvania. So here we have the first two books were citing that they have this passenger list all coming from these colonial records, volume 3, page 288, and yet when we look at that volume, we have a third spelling of this particular name. This is to remind you that you need to consider looking at the variant spellings, and that even when something is saying it got its information from this specific volume, this specific page, you need to look at that specific volume and that specific page, because as you can see here, there can be difference in the information. As we transitioned into what became the US government and statehood, the documents began to change a bit, but they are still maintained informally at the differing ports. Thomas Wilson from Liverpool came to Philadelphia April 3rd of 1800. Here we have the cargo burden of 245 tons for this particular ship, and a listing of package and contents, who shipped them, who it was consigned or ordered for, and their residence. So from this ship manifest, we can see that Rathbone, Hughes, and Duncan sent for 95 crates of earthenware, 2 casks, 2 boxes of merchandise, 1 hogshead, 6,000 bushels of salt, and 25 tons, 400 coats or coals to Shoemaker and Bennett. So here we have a listing of all of this content being shipped over to Philadelphia. But where's our passengers? Would you believe the passengers are actually listed at the very bottom of this page? This little notation here at the very bottom says that James Kenworthy, Joseph Schofield, James Schofield, Mrs. Scott, and her child were traveling on this particular ship. Each of the passengers had 1 trunk and bedding with them. This is our passenger list for this particular ship in 1800 coming to Philadelphia. This was important to the person who was managing the ship line. Their biggest profit at this time was, well, their cargo. So this is what they were documenting. And the United States was not documenting passengers at this time. So you do have to look at these and look for those passengers. In 1819, the Sewage Act came into place, where a ship's captain had to provide a manifest that was filed with the Customs Service. The ship's captain would collect the names, and then the records would be kept at the port of entry. Here's the thing about that ship captain, though. Do you believe the ship captain would have gone around collecting those names, or most likely he assigned it to someone who would go around collecting the information that you see on the screen, the questions that were being asked at the time? And that individual would then note the immigrant coming over. So if you have an individual who was given this assignment by his captain, what if he speaks a different tongue than his passengers? This is where you start to see some of the discrepancies as the collection of these records are done, because the ship's captain is assigning someone to keep these records for him. And then they're filed at the port. Here we have June 1st of 1852, so 52 years after that last passenger list we just looked at. This is the ship Parsi, and it is coming from Liverpool, England to New York. Here we have Agnes Curl, 28-year-old male, it's a farmer, coming from Ireland to the US. Note that in this passenger list, the person who took the information actually noted not only is Agnes a farmer, but also noted and family. We could have assumed that these individuals with the same last name were family members, but that would have been an assumption. And thankfully, whoever took down this information noted that this is a family grouping for us. So not only do we have Agnes, we also have other members of the family, all the way down to Edward, who is an infant at the bottom of this image. 1891, the US government implemented the Immigration Act, which formed what became the Immigration Service, which took over the duties from the ship's captain of collecting those ship manifests. And they wound up examining the ship's passengers as they came into the United States. These federal immigration officials collected the names. There were a number of laws that excluded undesirables such as convicts, prostitutes, polygamists, those with illnesses, those who were crippled, or those who would require public assistance. These federal immigration officials were translators, and they required documentation from those coming into the United States because of these various laws. So this is a time period where the spelling of the name is not changing at the entry point. The spelling of the name may change because the immigrant changes it after they come into the United States, but at the actual entry point into the US, they are translators and these immigrant officials who are processing the people and documenting them. In 1906, the Immigration and Naturalization Service was created, who took over keeping these records. So, in this time period, our passenger lists start to provide us far more details on our ancestors, such as this one for the Vanderland, which arrived in New York on May 30th, 1906. On this record, we find Josefa Berenska, 23 years old, traveling with Vladislava Tapolska, who is 8, and Fanina Berezinska, who is 3 months. These are traveling companions, 2 with the same last name, 1 with a different last name. Continuing looking at this particular passenger list, we see that Josefa is visiting her husband, Roman, who resides at this address in Chicago. Very faintly, where the arrow is pointed, you can see that Vlaslava is stated as being where she is visiting her brother-in-law. This gives us the possibility that Josefa and Vlaslava were sisters. So just going back to that one real quick. So as you can see here, where the arrow is pointing, it says other relations. It's very, very faint, but it says brother-in-law. And this is our first indication that there might be a relationship here. So what else is available besides these passenger lists? We just discussed the fact that the federal government didn't start collecting these until about 1820. And then some of the information, we don't know who's providing it, who's writing it down. So what other records is available to us? One of those records that's really key is naturalization records. Naturalization is the legal procedure by which an alien becomes a citizen of a country. And in the colonial era, British subjects traveling to the British colonies would not necessarily be documented because it's like going across the state border, because it's a British subject coming, well, to British property. But non-British citizens, such as Germans, had to sign an oath of fidelity to come in to a British colony. This is where we can start finding records. Many decreed that the ship's captains must provide a manifest and appear before the council to report the number of immigrants and attest to their character for them to enter a colony. And so that's where we start to get sort of this passenger list, but also the ship's captain is attesting to the character of the person coming into that particular colony. For a naturalization, there was two types during the colonial era. One was called denization. This is where the immigrant paid a fee, took an oath, but did not renounce their citizenry to their original country. They weren't an official citizen of the colony. They did it to obtain land, but they were not allowed to hold any public office or vote. Another type of naturalization in the colonial era was an oath of allegiance. This is where the person renounced any foreign loyalties. It allowed the immigrant to buy land, vote, and to hold office. An example of one of these is persons naturalized in the province of Pennsylvania, 1740 to 1773. This book documents things such as this: Supreme Court in Philadelphia, Michael Bentley of Lancaster County was naturalized September 18, 1743, along with Matthias Higner and Mikhail Henninger of Philadelphia County. In 1790, the first Naturalization Act allowed any free white person over 21 to become a U.S. citizen. Subsequently, the naturalization law has changed over the years, and there are some volumes in your handout that will help you with the various laws. Before 1906, though, any naturalization that took place was handled by any court that carried a seal. Each court had its own procedures. So where your ancestor resided determined where they went to become naturalized. They went to whichever court was the closest. So those living in more rural areas, it helps to be able to narrow down the closest courthouse. For those living in bigger cities, though, it starts to become complicated because you have city courts, county courts, you have federal courts, you have state courts, you have regional courts. So there's a number of different places they could have gone. Determining which one was physically the closest helps you. The first thing that your immigrant had to do before 1906 was they had to declare their intent. which is sometimes called first papers. This is when a person who wants to become a citizen relinquishes their allegiance to another country and declares they want to be a U.S. citizen. Keep in mind, though, many people file declarations but never followed through to actually become a citizen. The next document that your ancestor had to complete was a petition for naturalization, which eventually led to the naturalization certificate and their final papers. These could be filed in a separate court than where they declared their intent. And it's found separately or as part of the court dockets. So wherever was the local court, if they happened to be living in Ohio at one point and declared their intent, but a few years later when they became a U.S. citizen, they lived in Illinois, they would have filed to become a U.S. citizen and applied their petition for naturalization in Illinois, but their declaration of intent could still be in the Ohio court. So you need to keep in mind where your ancestor resided. This is where that chronological listing of the events in a person's life becomes critical. Here's an example from the late 1700s for what a naturalization ledger entry could look like. Here we have Samuel Bryson, Fayette County, Franklin Township, who was from Ireland. He is saying he's a subject of the King of Britain, and he was naturalized on May 23rd, 1798. Not much information provided in this 18th century naturalization record, but it is a document for your immigrants. Moving into the mid to late 1800s, here we have one for Henry Yost. This one says he was born in Prussia, Germany on September 3rd of 1844. Says he arrived in Boston on September 10th of 1859, and that he renounces his allegiance on October 21st, 1872, when he took an oath of allegiance. So a little bit more detail is provided here on this 19th century naturalization record. Post-1906 naturalization laws were changed again because in 1906, the Bureau of Immigration and Naturalization was created. With this bureau being created, the federal government took over the collection of the naturalization process and made all of those applications that all the courts were doing more uniform. Now, they were not the ones processing these. It was still being done at the courts, so the records can be held at the courts, but they were also filed with the federal government. So at this point, starting in 1906, you do have a single place with the federal government to search for these naturalization records. At this time, in 1906, it was firmly established that a person had to be in the United States for 2 years in order to file their declaration of intent or their first papers. And they had to be in the United States for 5 years in order to actually apply to become a naturalized citizen. One of the best ways for you to start discovering immigration and naturalization details in the post-1906 era is actually the U.S. Census. Here we have an example in 1910 in which we have, living on Fruit Street in Chicago, we have a Michael Tapolsky, who is the brother-in-law, according to the census, to Joe Bozensky. Michael, according to the census, is from the Polish section of Poland, and Joe is from the Russian section of Poland. Noting these details about the immigrant and where they are from over the years can actually help you start mapping out where they were in the other country. Both of these men arrived in 1902. Michael has filed his first papers according to the census, and Joe is still an alien and has not applied at all to become a U.S. citizen or to declare his intent. Looking at the 1920 census, Michael Topol, the name change in spelling has occurred here. He's living here with his wife Wanda in 1920 in Chicago. He is from the Russian section of Poland, and his wife is from the German section of Poland. In the census, we see he arrived in 1899. 1910, he said it's 3 years off from what he said in 1910, but that's fine. Sometimes our memories aren't clear, and so the information provided here, it's close, so we're going to go with it because all the other pieces are matching. His wife Wanda says that she arrived in 1904, and they are both naturalized in 1913. So, looking for Michael, I find Michael Joseph Tapolsky petitioned to become a U.S. citizen in 1930, as he stated on the census, and he is living at that address on Throop Street in Chicago, the one that is listed on the 1910 census. We are given that he was born in 1886 in Russia, that he arrived April 5th, 1903, in New York from Bremen, Germany, on the ship Colonial Louise. Boy, that's a lot more information now than what was on the 2 previous naturalization records we've seen. Look at all this detail that you can find on your immigrants. He declared his intent March 11th, 1910. The 1910 census said that he had filed his first papers. The census was taken April 15th, 1910, so he truly, 1 month prior to the census, had declared his intent to become a citizen, so it is accurate that he filed his first papers. On his petition, he says he's not married, and interestingly enough, this petition was denied due to one of his witnesses being incompetent. So, here we have another petition for Michael in 1914 in Chicago, because in 1920, he is naturalized. So looking for him again, I see that his information is the same for this petition. His arrival is off by a few days, but it's still the same ship. He is now married to Wanda, who is his wife in the 1920 census that we looked at. And it states here that she is from Germany. It does mention that 1913 petition and that it had been denied because of a witness being incompetent. But here we have September 28, 1914, Michael and Wanda are naturalized. Because of the various laws at this time, Wanda doesn't have to file paperwork. As his wife, she is legally, because he becomes a U.S. citizen, she gets derivative naturalization, and because her husband's naturalized, she now is. Based on the information provided in those documents, you can actually trace to the passenger list from New York for that particular ship, the Colonial Louise, on April 3rd, 1903, with that passenger, Michael Tapolsky. And look who's right below him, Joseph Basinski, that brother-in-law that he was residing with in 1910. They both immigrated over to the United States together. Look at this information that we have that started off with the census, led to us finding his petition, and then eventually led us to the passenger list, showing that these 2 gentlemen traveled over together. And their place of arrival that they were going to in the United States, that they had given as their final destination, was Chicago, where we wound up first finding them in the 1910 census. This is why you should definitely look at the census when looking for your immigrant ancestor. Look at how those details can lead you to actually the naturalization records and then eventually the passenger list. Other supplemental records for you to consider are records such as these passport applications. These are available from 1795 to 1929. You had to be a citizen to get a passport. And this is an example from the 19th century. Looks like a pretty lengthy document already for us to explore. And so here we have Gustav Neff. We're told that he's born November 28th of 1850 in Switzerland. He immigrated on the Victoria from London, August 24th, 1880. Now, we looked at a 19th century naturalization record a moment ago. There was not this level of detail provided in that naturalization record, but look at what we can find for a passport application for this individual who is an immigrant. This is why we look at supplementals. He was naturalized in Floyd County Courts on May 30th, 1894. We are given his physical description and that the passport was issued on August 20th, 1895. Here's another example from the 20th century. This one is Carmelo Di Pietro. We're told he was born February 27th, 1897 in Italy. We are told his father is Francesco Di Pietro, and his father is still residing in the town of Fonticelli, Italy. We are given they immigrated from Naples, Italy on October 12th of 1913. He resided from 1913 to 1920 at Detroit, Birmingham, and the U.S. Army, and that he was naturalized before a special pact of Congress at Wichita Falls, Texas, on July 12, 1918. Wonder what was going on about that time period. We have a mention of U.S. Army, and we have a mention of naturalization in this time period, but by an act of Congress for this time period. Starts to make you think there might be a military connection here. More information on this immigrant. But with his passport application, there's just that hint. But what we do learn from this passport application, we learn that he's traveling for 3 months back to Italy to settle estates. He's also traveling to France to visit some relatives. He's going to travel from New York on the ship America on June 2nd, 1920. We are given that he took an oath of allegiance again. We are given his physical description and that he was given a passport on May 12th, 1920, just in time for him to sail on June 2nd. And we get this very handsome photo of Carmelo. Look at all this from a passport application for your immigrant. Not the passenger list, but well worth it, I would think. Another supplemental record to consider are alien registrations. In 1917 to 1918, there was a registration affidavits of alien enemies that was collected. In 1917, any German male residing in the United States who was 14 or older had to register as an alien enemy. In 1918, any Austro-Hungarian and German males and females had to register. And then in 1940, beginning in August, there was the Alien Registration Act, where those aliens age 14 and older had to be fingerprinted and recorded at their local county courthouse. Based on these documents, here we have one for Lena Brockman. She was required to register under the President's Proclamation, April 19th, 1918, and she was in Graham County, Kansas. We are given in these records her maiden name of Susselman. We are also given, she was born in 1871 in Germany. We're told her husband is Herman Brockman. We're given a listing of her children, their date of birth, and where they are currently residing in the United States. Look at all those children. We are given information about her parents. We are also told that both of her parents are deceased. We find that her brother Henry Susselman is residing in Oklahoma. We find that she arrived in the US on March 19th, 1889 in New York on the ship Aller. We're given her husband's immigration information as well as her picture. All of this because she had to register as an alien enemy in 1918. So if we don't find her passenger list, this is definitely a great record on an immigrant ancestor. Other places to look for supplemental information on your immigrants are things such as these volumes, Missing Friends, Irish Immigrant Advertisements, placed in the Boston Pilot for 1831 to 1920. So Irish immigrants arriving in the US were searching for details on their family who had previously migrated over. And so they would place these advertisements in the newspaper to see if anyone had information about what happened to their family members after they arrived in the United States. So here is a listing of advertisements from November of 1855. Looking for Thomas and Michael Clifford of Bradford County, Claire, formerly of County Limerick, who came to the US in 49, that would be 1849. Thomas landed in New York, Michael in Boston. Oops, sorry. James worked with them in Harlem, New York. Information of them will be received by their brother James, and then we're given James's address in Philadelphia. So look at this family information that we have for these three immigrants who came over to the United States in the mid-19th century. And they are in 3 different states: Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and New York. Other supplemental records, such as the New York Immigration Savings Bank information, can be very beneficial. The Irish Immigrant Society formed the bank from 1850 to 1883 so that the New York Irish community would have a local establishment in which to save, in which they could earn interest. Because recall, one of the things that the United States did not want was people coming over who would then be reliant on the government of the United States. They wanted people who were self-sufficient. And so this was a way for Irish immigrants to be able to come over and not be viewed as requiring public assistance. So the bank was set up for this purpose. So here we have an entry for September 22nd, 1865. This is for Edward Lawler. We are given that at this time he is living at 144 Fulton Street. He has the occupation of a carver. He was born 1838 in County Queens, arrived in the US in 1859 on the ship Kangaroo. He is married to Anne Murphy, and they do not have children. So there are other supplemental records you can consider looking for. There are records pertaining to the port of departure. A shortage in certain trades led to a 1773 edict that those leaving England and Scotland had to explain to the custom officials why they were leaving the country. So here we have the book, Immigrants from England to the American Colonies, which documents the individuals who left England, their age, their reason for leaving, the ship name they left on, the date and destination. So this list here is an example from London for 1774. And so you can see these individuals, and this might be the only documentation because this is the time period where it's the colonies. Someone coming from England, coming to an English colony, more difficult to find those records because it's like us crossing the state border. So here you have these types of records that at least give you information about your ancestor coming over to the colonies. The Württemberg Immigration Index is for the late 18th century, maintains about 60,000 applications from German and Prussian immigrants who were asking for permission to immigrate through Württemberg, Germany. So here we have an entry in the book for Johann Gottlieb Schlipp. We're told he was born December 1st, 1849 in Fernsbach. He applied for transportation to America in August of 1871 while he was residing in Bachnog. Based on this information, can start searching for for a passenger, and so find in 1886 a New York passenger list for the ship Wera with Johann Schlipp. He's 33. He's a farmer from Germany, along with his wife Elizabeth and his daughter Margaret. Due to the increase in passengers traveling through British ports beginning in 1890, immigrants had to be a British resident for 6 weeks in order to qualify for passage, which then created the UK Outward Passenger List. Here we have one for April 14th, 1898, the ship Wasteland from Queenstown, Ireland, and it was bound for Philadelphia. And in this list of passengers, we have James Golden. He's 23, single male laborer traveling from Ireland to Philadelphia. So these are passenger lists, but these are documents that are held at the port of departure rather than the port of entry. So where can we find these immigration and supplemental records? Where do we have to search? Besides the books I've shown you throughout the lecture today, there are other places to look. One of those places is Ancestry. So when you're at the Ancestry site, you can search immigration, or if you go all the way down on the first page under the quick links, they also have a link to immigration and travel. Both of these links take you to the same page, in which when you're here, you could do a search, or you can narrow by category, because as you can see from today, there's a number of different types of records besides passenger lists that have to do with your immigrant. So you can search among the passenger lists, naturalization records, and other supplemental type records here. In the passenger list, they do have featured data collections. These are the more popular ones. Or you can actually go what they call the card catalog. Such a librarian term, I know, but in the catalog, if you are seeking a certain locality, certain port, this is a great place to go because you're in the immigration collection, and you can tell them you're looking for immigration and you're looking in Pennsylvania, and then it will provide you a list of the immigration materials specific to Pennsylvania. Either way, you can look among the various records by narrowing by the categories on Ancestry. One of the items that is available is Philby's US and Canada Passenger and Immigration List Index, 1500s to 1900s. Currently has more than 4 million individuals indexed in these volumes. I only am providing you a picture of the 2 shelves that it appears on in our department here at the Genealogy Center, but this is actually a set that is multiple shelves, multiple volumes. But with this set, it indexes passenger lists and supplemental records, and it gives you the annotation and source information. So I'm going to tell you a secret. As much as we want you to come and look at these volumes on our shelves, they are actually indexed and available for you on Ancestry. So on Ancestry, you could search for a person. And so here I have Susanna Tennant, and that she arrived in America in 1752. I'm told the source is Peter Coldham's book, Bonded Passengers to America. I'm told it's in volume 7. And I do have to scroll down a bit, but it does provide me with the actual page number, page 44. Based off of that, I can then go look at this particular volume. So here I find Bonded Passengers to America, volume 7, go to page 44. Well, I discover Susanna Tennant, wife of Moses, sentenced to be transported to the American colonies for 7 years. Her trial was in Norwich in the summer of 1752. So based on this information, I don't necessarily have a passenger list, but boy, I would prefer to have this little key piece of information over a passenger list for her. I have her husband's name. I have where her trial took place. I know she was transported to the Americas, and that I know I want to seek more information about her. All of this from searching for her name in this index. There's some ethnic transcripts. Germans to America is a great series for those seeking German people who came over to America. Provides transcripts that lead you to the passenger list, such as this one for the ship Bremer, which arrived in New Orleans in 1854. Based on the listing of the passengers, we know we can search for this particular ship, this date, and we can then find this particular individual on the actual passenger list just by searching for his name in this book. This becomes very helpful because of the variant spellings, because we're talking about that time period where that ship captain assigned someone to write down those names. So we can quickly browse through these volumes for the variant spellings. Other places to search. In Family Search, if you click on their search button, you could actually search under the keywords for the word passenger and start seeing what passenger list they have available on their site. Other sites, American Ancestors, which is hosted by the New England Historical Genealogical Society. Also under their search tab, you can find immigration records. Same thing, Find My Past. Under their search tab, you can find immigration and travel. And then they provide you a search page, different types of records. And if you scroll down, they provide you more details about the passenger list for this particular collection. Lots of different websites provide these types of materials. So definitely when you are looking for your immigrant ancestor, look under the search tab and see if you can find the immigration collection on various sites. So I hope from today you've seen that knowing the law of the land improves your chances of discovering records on your immigrant ancestor, since varying laws created the varying documents you are seeking. That we have to follow the trail, and we have to accept that there may not be a passenger list for our immigrant, but if we look at the bigger picture and search based on ethnicity, the original country, we may discover more than just a passenger list. And I want you to make use of books and other resources when searching for your passenger list or your immigrant to find more of these immigrant-rich documents that tell you more about your ancestor than a passenger list ever would. So, do we have questions about our immigrant ancestors?